So I gather that the standard has been set rather high by Peter Tatchell telling you in detail about a wet dream, and I'm afraid I cannot possibly live up to this particular standard. So I hope you'll put up with something a little less dramatic. So I am basically going to take the opportunity to say something about some of the key arguments in this recent book, Unconditional Equals, and towards the end, which, I mean, is about sex and gender, because everything I write is about sex and gender, but it's not exclusively about sex and gender. And then towards the end of my comments, I want to sort of connect it with some more specific questions which relate to sex and gender in diverse societies, which I mean, in a sense, I'm particularly throwing open to you to tell me what you think about. Okay, so let me just start with, I mean, in a sense, one of the starting points. There are two big starting points for my thinking in this book. The first is the extraordinary gaps between the wonderful declarations about equality, particularly the Euro-American declarations of equality, during the last 3 to 4 centuries, and the enormity of the gap between claims about equality and the actual exclusions. Now, anyone who's done any work on gender, of course, is very familiar with how often people talk about, you know, all men are born equal, or, you know, we hold these truths to be self-evident, you know, that all men are created equal, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, men are born free and remain equal in rights. Anyone who's done work on gender is very familiar with the fact that women were not included in this, and it wasn't just a kind of like sort of linguistic accident that men was referred to. But this is something, I mean, women are half the human race, but this is something even larger than the human race, because these declarations of equality actually referred to a very small minority of humankind. They didn't include the people who were enslaved. They didn't include the hundreds of millions of people who were going to be colonized. They didn't include the poor. So, you know, there's something that really needs to be thought about the particular ways in which the language of equality was being articulated in this kind of history that leads up to what we claim as the current egalitarian age. So I mean, I've just sort of thrown in some examples from the kind of political theory literature. Rousseau, who saw the natural inequalities of health, bodily strength, or mental agility as minimal compared with the social inequalities that he saw as coming into existence with the invention of private property. So he's kind of got a very strong sense that kind of naturally, you know, men are more or less equal until you get this development of private property. But he represented the natural differences between the sexes as so extensive that they became a reason to treat men and women almost as a species apart. Kant, with his, you know, seemingly universal categorical imperative addressed to all humans, combined this with a racial taxonomy that expressed contempt for the lesser races, as he regarded them, and justified their enslavement. I mean, in fairness to Kant, he did change his views towards the end of his life, but, you know, nonetheless, he spent a long time somehow seeing these two things as kind of compatible in the same brain. John Stuart Mill, who was a fantastic supporter of women's equality, staunch critic of slavery, but he defended colonialism as necessary for what he regarded as backwards people. So all these examples, you really need to think, what is going on here? The other starting point, which is a contemporary one, is that in contemporary thinking about equality, and I'm thinking here particularly about political philosophers, where I think you get so many comments which imply this extraordinarily over-sanguine notion about the acceptance, the widespread acceptance of principles of human equality. So I've just got a couple of quotes here. One is from Richard Arneson. All persons share a fundamental equal moral status. All persons, simply by virtue of being persons, have equal basic dignity and worth. The bit in red is my putting an emphasis. These claims about basic human equality are profound and widely shared. They appear to mark a divide in moral thinking between a pre-modern world in which nobles are regarded as having greater worth than peasants, and humans outside one's own tribe or clan have little or no moral standing, and a modern world that repudiates these crude prejudices. Or a similar kind of statement in Tim Scanlon's recent book about why does inequality matter. Basic moral equality is now widely accepted even among people who reject substantive egalitarian claims. So there's this, you look around the world today, it is so evident that basic moral equality is not accepted. We live in societies which are, shot through with racism, with misogyny, with homophobia. I mean, what are people talking about when they say that it's widely accepted, right? So the kind of both the historical kind of extraordinary gap between the statements and the exclusions and the contemporary complacency about the extent to which basic moral equality is accepted, they pose a question. We need better explanations for the exclusions and more of a challenge to the complacency. And in thinking about this, it seemed to me that one important point about what's going on is that you get this turn towards nature as the reason to think of others as equals. I think this is part of the phenomenon that's kind of associated with what's seen as the kind of, the new modern idea of equality, is that it's framed as a matter of somehow facts about people. There's something about people that justifies us treating them as equals. The problem with nature is that it simultaneously creates alibis for thinking all too many people are naturally unfitted for equal treatment. So once you start talking about the reason why we should regard others as our equals is because as human beings we share a particular human nature, and this becomes the reason, the justification. It ends up with a kind of particular image of what the human being is, and sometimes it involves a particular image of rationality, and that was something that was particularly effective in terms of excluding women who were regarded as driven by their emotions rather than their reason. So they just didn't fit with this shared human nature. Sometimes the moral capacities that supposedly separate those deemed capable of being civilized from those considered impossible to educate, that became very useful in thinking about colonialism. And I think by the 19th century in Europe, you get particularly rigid binaries of gender and taxonomies of race. So there's something about the appeals to nature, which it seems to me is a feature of our contemporary way of thinking about equality, which works as much to establish gradations and exclusions as to assert commonality. And I think part of what is going on there is that there's a kind of prototype human that kind of comes into existence as the reason for thinking of us as humans, as equals. But it's constructed on the basis of a specific kind of human being, and I've just given three, references to some of the literature. Sylvia Wynter, who's a theorist and a poet from Jamaica, in her analysis, particularly of the Spanish conquest of the Americas and what she sees as the conception of the human that is coming to existence there. She talks about the over-representation of the white male European. Annibal Quijano links it very much to the kind of the relationship between conquerors and conquered. Again, he's thinking about the Spanish conquest of the Americas, the codification of the differences between conquerors and conquered in the idea of race, a supposedly different biological structure that place some in a natural situation of inferiority to the others. So you see again this kind of this focus on the nature, or this recent book that I've just read by Devin Batija called the lovely title, The Colour of Equality, which is a study of the French encyclopedias. Well, in fact, it's a study of three of the major encyclopedia projects in the 18th century. And one of the arguments that he makes in that is that that nature played this role in the encyclopedias very much as a reason for thinking of humans as equal, but also the fascination with humans as natural beings also spawned this whole fascination with racial classifications, so very intricate classifications of us as distinct. So somehow the two things seem to coexist. So that really is my first point, is that some part of the explanation of this lies in the way in which the turn towards nature as the reason for thinking of one another as equals has been deeply ambivalent in its impact. And I mean, to elaborate further on that, basically that when we ground equality in a shared human nature, basically we are making the equality conditional. We're kind of explaining, or we're justifying, why should we treat others as equals? And it's as though the answer that we are giving to this it refers to something else, right? There's got to be something about us, some fact about us, something about, our nature as humans, that is what explains and justifies this equality. Obviously, in contemporary thinking, certainly in the philosophical thinking, the bar is set much lower than in earlier historical versions when it included or implied race or gender. But the argument is still caught up in what I would call a logic of justification that's looking to some way of grounding, some way of justifying. Why should we regard these people as equal? Must be some fact about them, right? Must be something about them which is the human characteristic which justifies it. And there's been a whole sort of growing literature on what is the basis for this belief in our human equality. What is it that grounds this belief that we have in human equality? And I've just cited some: Ian Carter, Jeremy Waldron, the collection edited by Lewis Steinhoff, Do All Persons Have Equal Moral Worth? The problem with this way of thinking about equality is that the characteristics which are supposed to be the explanation, the justification, the reason for thinking of others as equals, they become a test. We're being treated as equals because of something else, right? Because of this, this set of human properties that we supposedly share, and people have lots of different candidates that they throw up as their examples of these properties. But of course, if by some chance you don't exhibit this property, or don't exhibit it sufficiently, you thereby risk relinquishing your claim towards equality. So, in a sense, asking why and whether we are moral equals, to me, is the wrong question, right? That's not the question we should be asking, because once you start asking that question, well, why? Why should we regard others as our moral equals? What's the basis for thinking of others as our moral equals? You're into this language of justification, conditionality, which implies that there might very well be conditions in which we are not, in fact, such. And out of that, really, what I want to say is that equality needs no justification. If you go back to in the 19th century, a lot of the literature talks about people being moral and intellectual equals, and this is the language that is used a lot in arguments for the enfranchisement of women. Why should women equally have the vote with men? And people talk about them as, moral equals, intellectual equals, spiritual equals, and you get very similar language in the arguments against slavery, that people talk about white and black people as being moral and intellectual equals. That's a bit of a problem, in fact, that language, because in a sense, it's suggesting that the equality that you're claiming is based on this empirical claim that you're making about people's moral and spiritual and intellectual equality. So it's kind of, you know, really, should one need that kind of argument in order to justify treating women as equals to men or black people as equal to white? And I just use as a kind of, I suppose, an illustration of why I think looking for the justification for equality can get you into the wrong way of thinking about it. And this is just from Frederick Douglass's very famous speech, "What to the slave is the 4th of July." So he's kind of, it's in the American context at the time of the celebrations of the Declaration of Independence, which makes these great statements about, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are born equal, but make them at a time in which a considerable part of the economy of the United States depends on slavery and will continue to do so for many, many decades. And in this kind of condemnation of slavery, he refuses to argue that slaves are men, right? I shouldn't have to argue with you that slaves are men. I shouldn't have to argue with you that men are entitled to liberty. And, you know, he shouldn't have to argue that it's wrong to flay their flesh with the lash, to load their limbs with irons, to sell them at auctions, to sunder their families, to knock out their teeth, to burn their flesh, to starve them into obedience and submission to their masters. Basically, in this speech, he refuses the work of justification. He says, "No, I will not. I have better employment for my time and strength. At a time like this, a scorching irony, not convincing argument is needed." So in a sense, it's that's the kind of way of approaching this issue that I would like to encourage you towards, in a sense, that there are, it's a kind of refusal to justify what should not require justification. And I mean, we can come back in discussion to how that helps you when you're actually dealing with people who reject the notion of equality, you know, what kind of arguments one uses. But the point just at this stage is just to say, there are certain things that we shouldn't have to justify, and equality, the equality of all human beings, it seems to me, is precisely one of those. So the alternative account that I want to argue for is thinking of, the way I think of it is thinking of equality as a commitment and a claim. So basically getting away from the idea that equality is in any sense about nature, in any sense based on facts about us, not conditional on us exhibiting particular human properties, and not something we should feel obliged to justify by reference to any such characteristics. So thinking of equality as the claim that we make on others when they fail to recognise us as their equals. So equality is a claim. I assert my equality, right? I don't have to justify it. And the commitment that we make to others and to ourselves to regard one another as equals. So there's something about the language of equality that we've kind of become accustomed to over the last few centuries, in which we think of equality as something we find out about people, something we discover about people. But instead of thinking of it in that way, just to think of equality as something we bring into existence through the commitments and the claims and the political assertions that we make. So not a matter of finding out that others are sufficiently like us to be regarded as our equals. And this, of course, is very relevant for thinking about issues of sex and gender in diverse societies, because one of the ways in which people deal with diversity is through when they're looking at kind of contrast between different kinds of, different cultural contexts, huge variations in social norms across different societies, people focus in on, but these people are these people sufficiently like us to be recognised as our equals? It seems to me that that is not the way we should be thinking about equality. We shouldn't be searching for evidence, proof, reasons for recognising that people are sufficiently like us to be regarded as our equals. It should not be a matter of that. So thinking of equality as something that we do, and of course on contemporary evidence, something that we don't yet do very well. And I just say there's a bit of a kind of cross-reference here to some of the things that Hannah Arendt argues about political equality. I mean, one of the things that Hannah Arendt says about political equality is that it's not, basically that political equality, it's not that we meet some condition which then justifies allowing us to be politically equal, but rather that the kind of political equality is the condition, in her argument, for us having a political community. I mean, I think I'm saying that we need to do something rather larger than what Arendt was doing, but there's a similar kind of structure to the argument. Now, in terms of the questions that people often raise in relation to this very quick run-through of some of the key things that I'm trying to argue in this book, one of the obvious questions that people raise is, well, you know, if my starting point, one of my starting points is that actually we don't live in worlds in which basic moral equality is accepted, right? I mean, that's one of my starting points, is that this is an extraordinarily over-sanguine reading of the contemporary world to imagine that we've got to a stage where basic moral equality is accepted. We don't agree about the distribution of resources, but we all agree that we're all, as humans, equals. This is such an over-sanguine reading of things. And then people say, well, you know, I accept your starting point. It's true that this is over-sanguine. But aren't you, in your argument, depriving us of one of the key resources that we have for convincing people to see one another as their equals, which has been very much the argument of, don't you see how like us people fundamentally are, right? I mean, this has been one of the very standard ways in which one makes the argument, whether it's an argument for gender equality, whether it's an argument for equality across diverse cultures, the use of this, but don't you see that fundamentally, you know, we all sort of share these characteristics. So if you think of the, you know, when people are sort of challenging inhumane treatment of refugees, for example, or of asylum seekers, very often the kind of what seems the most compelling argument is to say things like, don't you see that these people, just like you know, they are fleeing persecution. They are, I mean, just, you know, you would hate to live under persecution. They are fleeing persecution. They are trying to protect their children, just in the way that you might try to protect your children. They are trying to get a better life, just in the way in which you might try to get a better life. In other words, the arguments are very often of the form of, can't you see how similar these people are to you? And it is a kind of powerful kind of argument, and I'm not saying that we should stop using those arguments, because I think getting people to seize those similarities and through that to empathise with other people's situation is a very important part of kind of, you know, wakening us up to the idea of equality. The problem is when those claims about the likeness become the justification and the basis and the grounding for the equality. So that if you came across somebody who actually didn't care about protecting their children, or you came across somebody who didn't actually care about having a better life, or actually didn't mind living under persecution, or, you know, whatever it was you'd offered as your argument, then you'd have to say, oh, well, in that case, I don't think this person is my equal. You know, we mustn't get ourselves into that kind of situation. The two queries I want to kind of focus on, however, are ones which have arisen for me, particularly in the context of thinking about this in a lecture series which is about sex and gender in diverse societies. So this is the first of the questions. In the current literature on sex and gender, a really crucial intellectual tool is the notion of intersectionality, which has become a really important way of trying to think through issues of sex and gender. And the question that I ask myself, really, about my line of argument at the moment is, what difference does it make whether one thinks of these issues that I've just been talking about through the notion of intersectionality or through a series of analogies and parallels? And it seems to me that just reflecting on my own trajectory in relation to this, that a lot of my thinking about these issues has involved a movement from gender to other axes of oppression and inequality. That is, very often my thinking about questions of equality and inequality has started with an analysis of the kind of the processes and the mechanisms and the language that actually constructs women as subordinate to men, and then has kind of developed from the insights from that and applied it to thinking about racial subordination, or applied it to thinking about questions of cultural domination. So, for example, I've been very influenced in my thinking by the way the Carol Pateman, feminist political theorist, traced the kind of the ways in which gender was or wasn't spoken in the writings of the 17th and 18th century social contract theorists, and pulling out the ways in which the language of social contract, which seemed to be about people born equal, making agreements among themselves in order to kind of construct a system of authority that they then accepted as legitimate, that she traces through this the prior subordination of women, the ways in which the contract theory abstracts from the body, the ways in which it constructs a notion of these individuals who contract from what she argues to be a prototypical experience of the male. And I think in my own thinking, I mean, I've kind of, in a sense, it has seemed to me that that's something which, of course, one can generalize much more widely than even the half the human race, which is women, to a wider understanding of what seems to me the false universality, very often attached to ideas of the citizen, the individual, the human, which is what I've really been talking about in my lecture so far, that false universality of the human. Or in thinking about the tension that many people have written about and thought about, tensions between the politics of feminism and the politics of multiculturalism. I mean, in essence, because the politics of multiculturalism, to the extent that it endorses the authority of cultural leaders who may themselves have reasons not to promote women's rights within their culture, where does a feminist stand in relation to that? And my own thinking about this, again, has been very much a kind of movement from thinking about gender to thinking about other forms of oppression and inequality. So in the case of feminism, it seems to me a lot of the one of the things that is very characteristic of patterns of gender subordination is a kind of a double exaggeration and yet obliteration of gender, by which I mean that that you have, just checking to see if this is, yeah, I elaborate this in the next slide, so I'll just knowing that. So that you have this double exaggeration, so that you have both people exaggerate differences between the sexes, and that becomes a kind of, major fundamental justification for the unequal treatment of the sexes. But at the same time, gender is so often obliterated. So people talk about man, talk about the human, don't actually notice whether they're talking about men or talking about women. In a sense, work as if gender is completely irrelevant. And in the process, they obliterate, they sort of obliterate the actual subordination that goes on. So that kind of double exaggeration and obliteration, which characterizes so many practices around gender, which includes the way in which, you get this in Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex very strongly, the way in which man becomes the center of the universe against which woman is always measured. A lot of those kind of characteristics, it seems to me, illuminate how one might think about very parallel phenomena as regards culture. So, just as in the case of gender, you have too much and too little gender, right? This is a kind of phenomenon. Either gender is kind of written so large that any differences are hugely exaggerated, so that men and women are represented or represent themselves as fundamentally different, so that's too much gender. Or gender goes invisible. You don't even notice that when you talk about human rights, you're actually talking about the rights of half of the humans. So that the kind of the too much or the too little gender, which so many theorists of gender have talked about, right? This is a kind of widely recognized phenomenon. There's a very similar kind of process in relation to cultural difference, that you get the exaggeration of cultural difference, as if people in different cultures, particularly people of what are regarded as a minority or a non-Western culture, are represented as thinking or acting in sort of fundamentally different ways, right? But at the same time, the cultural characteristics of the dominant groups are rendered invisible, so as if they don't have any, as if we don't have any culture, right? So that you get a very similar phenomenon of both too much culture and the obliteration of culture. So those are illustrations, it seems to me, of ways in which the trajectory of my thinking has very often been starting from insights about how to make sense of the ways in which gender is both exaggerated and made invisible, ways in which very similar phenomena operate in relation to culture. But if you think about the structure of that argument, it's an argument from analogy and from extension, right? It's deploying insights from gender to the analysis of race or culture. And of course, one could have done this the other way around. You might be an expert on thinking about racial subordination and then might, from this, extend your insights to thinking about gender subordination. Is there a problem, and I'm asking this of myself, is there a problem that kind of structure of the argument, which, as I say, is an argument by analogies and by extension, that the kind of, you can see, if you think about what's going on in the subordinations around gender, it enables you to see very similar things going on around race, very similar things going on around culture. That's different from what's become a major intellectual tool in contemporary gender theory, which is intersectionality. So intersectionality certainly isn't just saying we should think of all these things together. It's not just saying, well, you can't think of gender without also thinking about race, without also thinking about class. It's not just saying that. Intersectionality is not just saying that, and it's not just saying, as I seem to be saying, that the insights that one gets from thinking about one set of inequalities can illuminate, or should illuminate, the way you think about other sets of inequalities, as argued by the original theorist, for example, Kimberly Crenshaw. Intersectionality is proposing a much more specific argument about thinking about the ways in which those people who are positioned at the intersections of different sets of power relations, so that at the intersections of the gender subordination, the racial subordination, the class subordination, are exposed to a kind of a multiplicity of relations of domination that mean that their situation is very distinctive and, in a sense, multiply dominated, so that if you don't actually focus on that specificity, you end up with generalizations about the nature of gender subordination or the nature of kind of racism, which don't really address those particular groups of people who exist at the kind of the multiple intersections. So that's a very different kind of argument from what seems to be going on in my own work. So I'm just asking myself and you, and if you have any insights, let me know, is it a problem that the structure of my own argument takes the form more of these analogies and similarities between different kinds of subordination, as compared with what is a very dominant tool within contemporary gender theory, which is the notion of intersectionality. So I throw that at you because it's something I'm thinking about myself. And then the second query, this is my final question really, to you and to me, which is, what does this commitment to equality, which is what I'm arguing for, what does it imply about the content or the substance of equality? And I think this is something of special pertinence in thinking about questions of gender, sex and gender in diverse societies. So, I mean, just to go back a bit of a stage, one very appealing version of gender equality to me is a kind of world in which gender has lost its power to regulate and organise our lives, right? So that you would no longer be able to predict from somebody's gender what kind of roles or occupations or characteristics they had in the society. So you wouldn't be able to predict what kind of job people did, you wouldn't be able to predict what kind of subjects they studied, you wouldn't be able to predict whether they changed the nappies or sort of cleaned the car, you wouldn't be able to predict what kind of sort of personality they had. In a sense, gender would lose its power to organise and regulate and, in a sense, sort of allocate us to different positions in society. So that's my image of a world of gender equality. My image of a world of gender equality is a world in which gender's lost its power over us, right? So that, men and women, in that sense, become interchangeable, right? You might just as likely be the person taking the children to school as the person leading the army, say. And certainly within that kind of vision of gender equality, there would be no systematic differentiation between the sexes in terms of the division of labour within the household, right? Within the household, men and women would distribute the tasks between themselves, the tasks of caring for children, caring for parents, household tasks, house building tasks, would be distributed just randomly between us. And there'd be no sense in which there'd be women's jobs and men's jobs. That's my image, right? And it represents a very deep scepticism about the idea that we could live in societies where we have different roles, but nonetheless are equal, right? It represents a very deep scepticism about the idea that we could be separate, but equal, right? It seems to me there's a huge amount of historical evidence to the effect that when people have systematically different roles, that the roles that are feminized turn out to be of lesser value and have fewer rewards attached to them than the roles that are seen as masculine roles. So very deep scepticism. But that kind of very strong sense that I have about what gender equality ought to mean risks becoming what many feminists in recent years have picked up on as a kind of missionary feminism, right? In which I have such a strong sense of what gender equality ought to look like that I cannot believe that people think that they are equal when, for example, they have organised the division of labour within their households so that men take the sort of the main decisions within the household, and women primarily take responsibility for caring for the children or caring for those who are sick. And yet, the truth is that many women across the world, and indeed many women's movements across the world, argue that it's completely possible to have a gender differentiation in the division of labour, to have men and women performing different, distinct roles within societies. It's perfectly possible to have that, and for those men and women to be equals and to be recognised as equals. And so I have this very strong view of what the content of gender equality is, but I'm also very aware that saying that that is the only possibility for gender equality is kind of like it's setting up one particular model of gender equality as the only possible model. And in the process, it's refusing to listen to, refusing to, in a sense, countenance the possibility that there might be other ways of thinking about gender equality that are compatible with a greater degree of gender difference. The way I've tried to resolve it in the book, because it's been it's something that's much debated currently within feminist theory about how one can think about equality without, in a sense, having a very coercive or a very dictatorial notion of what that equality ought to look like. I've tried to resolve it by, in a sense, refusing to give too specific a content to equality. That is, I've kind of linked it with arguments which go on in quite a lot of the contemporary political theory literature, in which people say that we should start from the problems of inequality rather than getting too much caught up in trying to specify what is this equality that we want. We should allow a certain openness about the way in which we think about what equality looks like, because after all we're a very, very long way away from it anyway, and we should simply focus our attentions, to begin with at any rate, on challenging the inequalities and the oppressions. And that's where I've ended up, but I'm a bit I'm not entirely satisfied with it, because, people will say, well, how can you know what's unequal unless you have some clear sense of what's equal? It's not entirely clear to me that it's a satisfactory solution, but it certainly is clear to me that it is a serious question about how one can think about equality and inequality without falling into promoting such a kind of fixed single vision of what gender equality is, that in a sense you end up setting yourself up as kind of, the only person who has the answer to problems that all of us deal with in many parts of our lives. So again, that's a second set of questions which, you may have all kinds of questions anyway about the first part of what I said in the lecture, but those are questions that I'd also like to throw over to you, because those are ones that I feel confident about the first set of things that I talked to you about, but I think there are, it would be very interesting to me have your thoughts on the second sets of issues as well. So thank you very much. And